I'd like to go over end of chapter problem 4.5 with you. It starts on page 117 of your textbook and goes to the top of page 118. And this problem really conceptually outlines what's going on with the cost allocation process, which I know can be a little bit confusing at times, but really it's a very simple idea. And that idea stems from the primary assumption that when you're working with organizations with multiple departments, and that's a very key distinguishing factor of why you would even want to allocate costs or have the need to allocate costs. When you have a multi-department organization, you are going to have departments that are non-revenue generating, typically in the corporate services arena, like human resources, strategy, finance, marketing, etc. And all of those departments incur costs for the benefit of revenue generating patient care areas. And so this process of allocating costs gives the patient care areas a more realistic idea of what it costs to run their business. So what does it cost to operate a diagnostic imaging facility? Or what does it cost to operate a physician practice? What does it cost to operate an OR? All of those various departments, the OR, the physician practice, etc., they all have their financial statements, the revenues that they generate and the expenses that are required to generate those revenues. And so this cost allocation process gives department managers a more realistic picture of what their business brings in and how much it costs to bring in that business. So this problem has a very basic three-department structure: the adult department, the peds department, and other departments. And all of the numbers I pulled from the case example found in your textbook. And so you can see here there are two cost drivers that we're going to evaluate in this problem. The first is the revenue cost driver. And so each department's revenues are listed, and in total, we're talking about this organization generating $5 million. The second cost driver is housekeeping hours, and you can see the actual number of hours utilized by each of the departments. The adult department used 1,500 hours versus the other departments using 500 hours. And they're both totaled. These cost drivers are totaled. So then the question becomes, this $100,000 housekeeping direct cost, which is from a non-patient revenue generating area, how do we allocate the $100,000 to each of those three departments, the adults, the peds, and other, so that it's a fair representation of how much they should pay for or how much they should contribute towards covering the housekeeping expenses? So the question really becomes, which method is better? Is it better to allocate costs according to revenue, or is it better to allocate costs according to housekeeping hours? So we're going to mathematically calculate what the implications are of using the various cost drivers for each of the departments. So let's first work with the revenue side. If we're going to use revenue as the cost driver, what we need is some way to divide the $100,000 and spread it across these three departments based on these revenue figures. If you recall, common size ratio analysis or vertical analysis allows us to take proportions of the whole, and that's what's going to serve as the basis for this analysis. So what we're going to do is look at proportionally. $3 million is what proportion of 5? And what proportion is 1.5 million out of 5? And what proportion is the 500,000 out of the 5 million? To get an idea of proportionately each department's contribution from a revenue side towards that $5 million total revenue figure. So you can see here what I've done is I've created an extra couple columns, revenue used as the allocation method. And what I did was I calculated that percent. If you look at the formula, it's B4, which is the 3 million revenue generated by the adult department, divided by the 5 million total from all three departments, with an absolute reference so that the cell is locked as I copy and paste that formula down. And as I do that, you can see the percentage of the revenue generated by each of the departments is 60% for adults, 30% for peds, and 10% for other. All the cost allocation method then is doing, if you're using revenue as that cost driver, is saying, okay, if the adult department generated 60% of the revenue, and we believe revenue is an effective cost allocation cost driver, then they being the adult department, should pay 60% of this $100,000 housekeeping expense. So all you're doing here mathematically is taking the percent that we just calculated, 60%, multiplied by the $100,000 housekeeping expense. And you would click and drag that formula all the way down to get $30,000 and $10,000 for the other two departments. The cost allocation for each department then, if you sum them together, should equal the original cost that we were trying to allocate. So working backwards to double check our work. If you highlight the three departments, cost allocation, and you look down here, the sum is $100,000, so that's a very quick visual check to make sure that we have allocated the housekeeping expenses, the $100,000, appropriately and wholly based on the revenue as the cost driver. Now, let's say we want to use hours as the cost allocation cost driver. So it's going to be the same process as we used for revenues. We need to have some sort of a percentage that takes the total hours and allocates proportionately based on the number of hours utilized by each department. So the same process, we're going to calculate a percent, a common size analysis. So we're going to take the C4, which is the adult utilization of housekeeping hours, which is 1,500, divided by the total housekeeping hours for the entire organization. Copy and paste that all the way down, and you'll see now the percentages are 30% for adults, 60% for peds, and 10% for other. Now again, you're going to take these percentages and apply it to the 100,000 to get an idea of how much each department should pay for based on housekeeping hours. So now, adults should be responsible for $30,000 of the total $100,000 cost, whereas peds should be responsible for $60,000 because they utilize 60% of the housekeeping hours in the organization, and 60% of $100,000 is $60,000, and so on and so forth. So now what is the comparison or the implication based on which cost driver that you can use? Well, you can see here that if you're the adult department manager, you would most certainly prefer the cost driver to be based on hours utilized versus revenue. So you generate a lot of revenue for the organization. 60% of the revenue of the organization is driven by the adult department, but comparatively they use very little housekeeping hours. So why would you as a department manager want to pay $60,000 for housekeeping services when technically you only use $30,000 worth of services based on hours utilized across the organization? Conversely, if you're the peds department manager, it would be more advantageous to you if revenues were used as the cost driver, because in this scenario you would pay less of the $100,000 housekeeping expense versus if you used hours. Now, it's more advantageous to do it that way, but from a cost driver standpoint, I would argue that if you're using more hours, you probably should pay more. And so it's probably more accurate if we were to use hours as the cost driver versus using the revenues. And from the other departments, it really is no different in terms of whether revenues or hours were used. So they would be indifferent as to which cost driver were used. But of course, this can change because as soon as other departments, revenues or housekeeping hours would change, it would change the bottom line number. And if the bottom line number changes, then the percentages begin to change. And as the percentages begin to change, the actual allocation amount, the dollar responsible for that department manager to pay towards the housekeeping costs, that would most certainly change as well. I hope that makes sense. If not, please post a question to the Q&A discussion board. Thanks.